From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laurel Porter.
Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Oregon's primary election 2024 is behind us, and now we can look ahead to the November election. And in Oregon, you're going to be hearing a lot about something called ranked choice voting. Instead of choosing just one candidate, voters can choose several, ranking them by preference. It's something Portland voters will use when deciding the mayor and auditors races and the races for the new 12-person city council. And Portland could just be the beginning of a larger effort. In November, Oregon voters will decide whether the entire state should use ranked choice voting for statewide and federal elections in the future. In this episode of Straight Talk, we'll look at that statewide ballot measure, referred to the ballot by last year's legislature. How did we get here? How does ranked choice voting work anyway? And what are its advantages and disadvantages? We are joined by Sol Mora, the political director at Oregon Ranked Choice Voting, where she focuses on managing and growing the coalition to pass ranked choice voting on the statewide level in Oregon. Sol grew up in Salem, graduated from Portland State University with a degree in women's studies. She's worked as a community organizer and coalition manager for several years with a focus on creating a more equitable government and democracy. Also joining us, Blair Beaubier. Blair is recognized as one of the leading experts on ranked choice voting, both in Oregon and nationally. He is a public interest attorney who's been a member of the Oregon Bar for 35 years. He and State Representative Dan Rayfield were the co-sponsors of the successful 2016 Benton County ranked choice voting ballot measure. Welcome to my guests, Sol Mora and Blair Beaubier. Welcome to Straight Talk. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Appreciate being here.
Well, let's start with you, Blair, because this is a big change going from ranked choice voting from the traditional ballot to this ranked choice voting. And it could be confusing, maybe somewhat intimidating to voters. So what is the most important thing that you want our viewers, voters, to know about ranked choice voting?
Very simply, Laurel, it's a better way to vote. I think that we as voters want to be able to have our voices heard. We want to make sure that our values are translated into our votes. We want to elect people that share our values. Right now, people are pretty frustrated with government and elections. There's a lot of negative attack ads out there. Campaigns are toxic. And ranked choice voting is a way to improve our elections, improve the political atmosphere. And I think it will give us hope for the future of our democracy, which is something we could really use right now.
Well, so let's continue to set the stage. How big of a deal is this for Oregon? How significant, and how are you preparing for it?
Yeah, so, like Blair said, one of the things that we are seeing as we go out and talk to Oregonians is that people are ready for a meaningful change, and our coalition of supporters includes over 45 organizations, and this includes many different communities here in Oregon. That's everything from young people to seniors to working class families, as well as rural voters. And I think that one of the uniting threads of why all of these different communities are supporting this change is that ranked choice voting can deliver on better representation, regardless of what your background is as a voter. And ultimately, it can lead to more accountable leadership.
And we'll get into all the details of that in just a moment. But let's take a look at a sample ballot. If this passes in Oregon, what voters would see when they open their ballot. So Sol, walk us through this. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so when voters receive their ballot, they now have the ability to rank the candidates in their order of preference. So for example, as a voter, you could say, this candidate really resonates with me. I'm going to place them as my first choice. This other candidate also resonates with me. I will place them as my second choice. It is up to each voter how many of those candidates they would like to rank. And if there's only one candidate that is speaking to you, you can just rank that one candidate and not rank any of the others. The thing though is that you have that choice now. Unlike the current system where you can only pick one, you have the ability to express your preferences and really use those rankings.
So how does it work in the primaries? The past Oregon primary, there are a couple of runoffs, top two people running off in November. Would we still see runoffs?
Yes, so this would be used in both the primary and the general election. So in the primary, each major political party would be able to use the ranking so that voters can determine which candidate from that party will move on into the general election.
And there'll still be closed primaries for the parties, right? That won't change. Well, let's take a look at a little video from fairvote.org. It's just a clip. That's an example of how this works, and then we'll talk about it.
Here, you select orange as your first choice candidate, yellow as your second, pink as your third, and green as your final choice. The first choices are counted. Yellow earned 35%, orange 21%, pink earned 28%, and green earned 16% of the vote. Because nobody won more than 50%, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked him as their first choice have their ballots count for their second choice. This continues until a candidate receives more than half of the votes, or 50% plus 1.
So the math might be a little confusing to people. I know it is for me and how it works, and that could lead to a little bit of distrust in the system. So Blair, help us understand how these ballots are counted.
Sure. So first of all, I want to say that the only math that people really need to know is 1, 2, 3. That's how they rank their ballots. That's the voter experience, and that's how simple it is. I love telling how my younger son used ranked choice voting in his kindergarten class, and they would use it to pick the projects that they were going to do on project day. So, Legos were very popular, but there's only so many Lego pieces to go around. So kids could put 1 for their first choice for Legos, maybe puzzles were number 2, finger painting number 3, and kids can do it. It's really simple. Ranked choice voting is used all around the world. It's used in our country from Alaska to Maine, from Utah to New York City, and in our Benton County where I live and where we put it on the ballot there. So it's really a very simple process.
Let's talk about how we got here, because a lot of people at home may not realize that this ballot, this measure, is going to be on the November ballot. And you mentioned other states that are using this, but this is the first time that it's been referred to the ballot by a legislature, by the Oregon legislature last year. So tell us a little bit more about the pathway from the legislature to the ballot in November.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the first time that a legislature has referred a ranked choice voting measure to the ballot. So there was a tremendous amount of community support to bring ranked choice voting statewide. There were groups like the League of Women Voters, the Communities of Color Coalition, the ACLU, and these advocates worked with representatives in the legislature to craft a bill. There was a lot of input from the Secretary of State, from county elections officials, and we all worked together and hammered out something that we think is a pretty good bill. It was vetted through a number of hearings, and then it passed both houses of the Oregon legislature, and they referred it to the ballot, and that's what we'll see come November.
And you mentioned Benton County. So Portlanders are going to be using this in November for the first time for city council, for the mayor, for the auditor's race. But they're not the first ones to use this in Oregon. Benton County voters have been using it, and you were instrumental. You co-sponsored the measure along with State Representative Dan Rayfield for the successful 2016 Benton County measure. How is it working there? You live in Benton County.
I do.
You use this. How's it working there? How do voters like it?
Voters love it, and voters are really satisfied with it just about everywhere it's been used. They like it, it's simple, they prefer it to the system that we have. So we passed it in 2016 in Benton County to use for our county commissioner races. We implemented it in 2020, and then shortly thereafter, the Corvallis City Council took it upon themselves to vote to use it for Corvallis elections for City Council and for mayor. And it was decisive in choosing the last mayor of Corvallis.
So let's talk about how this affects candidates. Now, supporters of ranked choice voting say it creates more of a pathway for candidates who might have similar values or backgrounds to run and not worry about splitting the vote. So how does that work? How and what kind of evidence do you have that that helps?
Yeah, so with ranked choice voting, because as a voter you're able to mark those different preferences, this is also positively impacting candidates because they don't have to worry that they're taking votes away from a similar candidate. One of the things that happens a lot with the current system is that candidates decide not to join a race at all because they have the fear that if there's a similar candidate, either in terms of background or in terms of the issues that they care about, they are going to spoil that election and take those votes away. And so with ranked choice voting as a voter, you don't have to think about that anymore. You don't have to think strategically about who has the best chance of winning. You can just rank the candidates in your order of preference, and ultimately, if your first choice doesn't win, you have backup choices. And so it is eliminating this fear that your voice will not count in that election, because ultimately, if you did rank those other candidates, you do have a greater say.
Let's talk about actually out campaigning. Let's say a candidate is out campaigning. They see a street sign in somebody's yard, a campaign sign for somebody. They might think, well, I won't go to that door because they're already going for that candidate. Does that change things?
Absolutely. You know, with ranked choice voting, candidates need to have a majority of the votes to win. And it's also changing the way that they're campaigning, like you said, because, you know, let's say that we're both candidates that have like-minded values. It benefits both of us to say, hey, if you support me, put me as your first choice, put Laurel as your second choice, and vice versa. And so you really are able to build a coalition amongst other candidates that support similar issues. And, you know, one of the examples I can think of is in Maine, in their 2018 governor's race, there were two Democratic candidates, Betsy Sweet and Mark Eves, and they did exactly that. Their ads were very positive, very civil, and they told voters, if you like both of us, then rank both of us.
And supporters of the system also say that it lowers barriers for more representation for women and candidates of color. Well, how does that work, and what evidence do you have that that's working?
Yeah, so in the places that do use ranked choice voting, we are seeing that more women, more young people, more first-time candidates, and candidates of color are deciding to enter the race. And it's not only that, they are winning at higher rates. And I think one of the reasons this is happening is because, again, they don't have that fear of splitting the vote with those similar candidates, and voters are able to rank those preferences. And as a voter, you can say, you know, traditionally, maybe this candidate wouldn't have a real chance in the current system, but with ranked choice voting, I know that I can believe in them enough to put them as my first choice because I have all of those other choices as well. And one of the places I really like to emphasize is New York City. In 2021, for their city council, they had a historic, diverse council with a majority of women and a majority of people of color. That was the first time in history that had happened, and it was thanks to ranked choice voting.
So they're using ranked choice voting there.
They are using it.
And we'll talk more about other places that are using it in a bit. So we talked about candidates. What about voters, Blair? How does this benefit the voter?
Voters get to, as Sol was saying, they get to vote their conscience. They can vote their first choice. They have backup choices. It gives them more voice. It gives them more power with their ballot. It's really a way to be more expressive with the ballot.
And we didn't see a great turnout in the Oregon primary in May. Will this affect turnout? Do you think, is there any evidence that turnout goes up with this system?
We would hope so. You give people more choices, and there are more candidates in the race, and we think that that will bring people out. Right now, people think if they have to vote for the lesser of two evils, they might as well stay home. But if there are more choices and their vote itself is going to be more meaningful, we think that's going to drive turnout up.
And I think I was reading that the youth vote might go up. Do you think that's going to happen?
We see that. We see that in a lot of places, and we've seen that in our own research, that younger voters are much more open to this. They love it. They're ready for change, and they're big supporters of ranked choice voting.
Okay, so we've done a lot of cheerleading here for ranked choice voting, but not everybody is a fan. There has been some opposition. In fact, when you were debating in the legislature and presenting your ideas, a lot of Republicans came out against it, including Representative Bobby Levy, who said ranked choice voting ultimately disconnects voters from issues and allows fringe candidates to win elections. As OPB reported, she argued it could result in candidates with relatively few preference votes winning office without a true mandate to govern. She called it obtuse deconstruction of political accountability. Blair, let's talk about that criticism.
Sure.
Is it possible for a fringe candidate to win without a mandate from voters?
No, it's just the opposite. So that there's no evidence to support that statement. It is rhetoric divorced from reality. Ranked choice voting is a majoritarian system, so you have to have broad-based support. You have to have a majority to win. It's our current system that could produce candidates with very little support, or a so-called fringe candidate, because right now there could be such vote splitting that a candidate can win a race with 20% of the vote. If you have a lot of candidates, you could win with 15% of the vote. So it's really quite the opposite.
And the other part of her argument, she says it disconnects voters from the issues. What about that?
Again, completely opposite. With ranked choice voting, it's going to be issue-oriented because, as Sol was saying, candidates want to reach out to the supporters of their opponents. So they don't want to trash that person. They want to say, look, this is where we agree. We both support labor unions, or we both support the environment, or we both support renters' rights. Whatever it is, they're going to look for the commonality and not be divisive.
Well, some county clerks in Oregon didn't really want to go along with this. They thought it was going to make the ballot too long with all of those races. So if this is passed by voters in November, it would not include, I understand, legislative races, right?
Correct.
So what really was their objection? Is that something they might come around to, do you think?
So we've worked closely with the county clerks as well as the Secretary of State's office for a number of years at this point. And in fact, because of their input, we decided to delay implementation of ranked choice voting until 2028. So hopefully we'll pass it in November, and then the clerks and the Secretary of State's office will have 4 long years to get everything ready. And we've worked with them, we'll continue to work with them. They're the folks on the front lines. They're running our elections, they do an awful lot of work. It's relatively thankless. We thank them, and we're happy to work with them in every and any way possible.
A lot of voters are discouraged by all the negative campaigning, the negative ads. We saw a lot during the primary in Oregon, and probably going to be a lot more as we go into the general election in November. So how does this affect negative campaigning? Do you think there'll be a reduction in negative ad campaigning if we were to go to ranked choice voting?
Absolutely. I do think there would be a reduction in that negative campaigning. And, it really goes back to the fact that candidates need to be broadly supported. In the current system, like Blair said, you do not need a majority of the votes to win. And so you can focus on appealing to special interests. You can focus on being the most well-funded candidate and really using those negative tactics to attack other individuals for who they are or for their personalities, and not really about their platform. And so with ranked choice voting, because you do need to broadly appeal to voters, you need to talk about the things that are on voters' minds. You need to really address what the big issues are in your campaigning, because that is what voters truly care about. And it's the same with the other candidates, right? It benefits you as a candidate to align yourself with a like-minded candidate. And so in that way, you do have this incentive to really think about what is that common ground with other candidates, right? What are the shared issues that we care about, and not do those negative attacks.
And Blair, before we go to break, I want to ask you something that the San Francisco Chronicle said in an op-ed. They said this strategy is just gaming the system. Is it?
I don't think so. I think that's nonsense. I was fortunate enough to be in San Francisco and in the Bay Area for an election and watch this on the ground. And I can tell you that candidates cooperated. Some of them held speaking events together. They put out joint mailers where they would say, vote, this slate, 1, 2, 3. Groups like the Sierra Club and different organizations also ranked candidates in order of preference. And the San Francisco Chronicle did their endorsements in order of preference. So it's the fact this gaming thing is nonsense. It's really just a very straightforward way to express your preferences and to get a candidate with majority support.
Blair and Sol, thank you. We need to take a break right now, but when we come back, we'll look at what other states are using ranked choice voting and how it's working there. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. In November, Oregonians will get the chance to decide whether to adopt a whole new voting system. It's called ranked choice voting. If voters approve November's measure, it would go into effect starting in 2028 for primary and general elections, including president, Congress, governor, and Oregon Secretary of State. The measure would also let cities and counties opt in to using the ranked choice voting system in their local elections. Welcome once again to my guest from the nonprofit Oregon Ranked Choice Voting. Sol Mora is the organization's political director, and Blair Bobier is a leading expert on ranked choice voting, both in Oregon and nationally. Welcome once again.
Thank you.
I want to revisit and kind of clarify something we talked about in the first segment about runoffs. And when I asked you about it, Sol, you were talking about the statewide races and federal races. But what about the local races, Blair? Are we going to see primaries? Like Portland didn't have a primary because people are voting in November. Help us understand that.
Right. So instead of having 2 rounds of elections like has been happening in Portland and Multnomah County, the primary, the first round, will be eliminated in May, and the entire election will be shifted to the November general election. And that's better because that's when voter turnout is at its highest. So ranked choice voting will be used in the November election, and if someone doesn't get a majority of the vote in the first round of counting, the votes get counted again, and the person who makes a majority, 50% plus 1, will be declared the winner.
So as we're seeing with the Portland citywide races, primaries are eliminated, and we won't be seeing those runoffs that we're seeing in Multnomah County coming up in November, right?
Yes, 1 election instead of 2.
Okay. Well, so let's talk about where else this is being used. And we have a map that shows the jurisdictions, the states and the jurisdictions using it. So kind of tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Absolutely. So ranked choice voting is currently used in over 50 different places here in the United States. I will also note it is used in other countries, but for the sake of this, let's focus on the United States. And it ranges from the local level all the way up to the statewide and the federal level. At the local level, some of the cities that use it include Santa Fe, New Mexico, San Francisco, California, Salt Lake City, Utah, New York City, New York. And at the statewide and the federal level, there are 2 states that currently use it, and those are Maine and Alaska. There are also a couple of states that use it for voters that are in the military or overseas, but again, in total, it does range from the local level all the way up to the statewide
So Oregon,
level.
if it passes, would be the 3rd state to use it statewide. Blair, what are voters saying in Alaska and Maine and some of these jurisdictions about ranked choice voting?
So everywhere that it's been used, voters like it. They use it, they use their rankings, so they'll take a first choice, they'll also use a second choice or a third choice, and the responses have been overwhelmingly positive. We know that people prefer it to the current system. They like having the choices, and they like the fact that their vote can be more expressive.
I read an article on the Oregon ranked choice voting website, which is very thorough, so worth checking it out. But it did say that this is not a panacea for what's wrong or what people think is wrong with the American political system. It's not going to fix everything, right? People shouldn't set their standards that high.
No, there's no silver bullet. It's a step in the right direction. It opens our elections up. It brings more voices in, gives people more choices. But there's other ways that we have to reform our elections. For example, campaign finance reform was passed in the legislature. And in fact, in San Francisco, public financing of elections coupled with ranked choice voting produced the most diverse board of supervisors in San Francisco history.
So we've mentioned that Portland is going to start using this system in November, and we're going to have on some election officials on late August, early September to talk about the Portland elections. Portland and Multnomah County elections officials will be here, so we'll dig into that then. But give us a preview. I mean, voters approved this in 2022 by 58% with the yes vote, also for the multi-district jurisdictions too. So tell us more about what Portland voters can expect come November when they get their ballots.
Yeah, so when voters receive their ballot in November, they will now be able to rank the candidates for local offices. So that includes the mayor, the city auditor, and the city council. You will be able to say, here are my top choices, rank them in your order of preference. At the same time, voters in Portland and voters across the state will also be able to say whether they would like to use the same system for statewide and federal offices. And so that is one of the decisions they will have. I will say for Portland, they are also moving to geographic districts, so it will be slightly different than what we are proposing at the statewide level. The city council districts are divided into 4 districts, 3 representatives per each of those districts. So if you live in Portland, you can expect to now have local representation depending on where you live in the city.
And then Multnomah County has already passed this, right? So they'll start, when do they start?
So they're implementing it right now, and it will first be used in 2026, so very soon after this 2024 election.
So for this ballot measure, there's not a number yet or a name for the measure. Blair, when can we expect that?
Well, we're waiting for the Oregon Supreme Court to let us know, and that should happen any day now.
But to be clear, this is a done deal. It is going to be on the ballot. There's not any question about that, right?
Yes, thank you for clarifying. There's no question that the measure will be on the ballot. It's just the ballot title. And so that's what we're waiting for clarification for from the Supreme Court, which will come any day. As soon as we have the title, then the Secretary of State will assign a measure number, and then we're off to the races.
So be watching for that in November. So Blair, 30 seconds for you for a final thought for our viewers tonight.
A simple way to improve our elections. That's what ranked choice voting is. It's used all over the world. It's used in a number of places in the United States. Voters like it. They prefer it to our current system. More choices, more meaningful choices, gives power back to the voters where it belongs.
And Sol, you can finish it up for us. 30 seconds.
You know, I think the thing I'll close out on is we all feel frustrated in one way or the other when it comes to the current state of politics and elections. And we know that we need to move towards a better system, and ranked choice voting can be that solution, so that regardless of who you are, regardless of what political party affiliation you have or what your background is, this is creating more reflective representation for all of us.
Sol Mora, Blair Bobier, thank you so much for joining us here on Straight Talk. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you as we get closer to the November election. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To learn more about this, check out the Oregon Ranked Choice Voting website at OregonRCV.org. That's OregonRCV.org, and look for the measure on your Oregon ballot in November. Thank you once again to my guests, and thank you for watching. Remember, you can get Straight Talk also as a podcast. Search for KGW Straight Talk wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next week for Straight Talk.